Let me ask you a question. If you were to design a game or movie today and were asked to make it about a catastrophe, how would you go about it? Got your answer? Right, well, most people would start by selecting a disaster, like alien invasion or mutant plague. Arguably a good place to start. Nice. Now, how do you incorporate a story into this? Would you have it set in the past or present tense? Maybe mix of both? Got your answer? Very nice. Now, here's a question that can make or break your story. How are you going to tell it? That might seem like a bit of a strange question at first. It shouldn't matter how a story is told, right? The reader or viewer sees it all the same way. Well, I'd argue that how a story is told directly impacts how the audience perceives it. There's a big difference between designing a world from the ground up to convey your story and just throwing a bunch of zombies in the field and pretending that there's a major plot point because they exist. And sure, that might seem obvious, but it's a mistake that many different shows and games make. It's easy to place an enemy in a spooky room and write up a few lines of lore for it. However, at least in my opinion, good games and shows about disasters will use literary techniques and visual information like world building and environmental storytelling to convey their story without using any words at all. So, how is this done properly? And what can we, the audience, take away from these key design features? A good game that shows these techniques well is Generation Zero. For the unfamiliar, Generation Zero is a post-apocalyptic game set in 1980s Sweden after a prototyped AI, dubbed Phoenix, gains control over advanced military machines originally designed for the Swedish military. It's a tale as old as time. People invent highly advanced AI eventually gains self-consciousness or develops a fatal bug of some sort, goes insane and kills everyone. But again, how it's told makes all the difference. Within the first few minutes of the game, you know effectively nothing. Sure, you know the game has killer robots, the first few lines of lore address that. However, no line of dialogue will tell you what happened here. No in-game character will ever tell you how effective these machines were at breaking down this country. It is well and truly up to the player to figure that out. Let me show you an example of what I mean. You can see here how the developers of the game tried to communicate their story, not just through words but through the world. Sure, dialogue storytelling is great because it allows creators to be specific when it comes to details like describing backstory or causes. That being said, in my opinion, environmental storytelling adds a whole new layer of atmosphere to the story and allows players to experience the story at a much more empathetic and emotional level. Being told about how a giant mech devastated a town despite the populace doing its best efforts to stop it is far different from being let free into the world and uncovering the aftermath on your own. This layer of emotion and atmosphere gives the game a much more dire tone when speaking about the story of the game and really shows how the developers can draw the players into the story through environments that have nothing to do with the player themselves. A key detail that stood out for me was how the context of the story flows through into the past tense. This is a bit of a difficult point for me to convey just by speaking about it, so I'll show you an example of what I'm trying to say. Context in good stories is the grounds for everything. You can create a game with amazing visuals, but if you aren't given details on the context or backgrounds of the story, i.e. what led up to the specific event, then it means basically nothing. A good example of what I'm trying to convey is The Last of Us. The Last of Us, in a dramatic oversimplification, is a story about how a viral infection has taken over the planet and caused mass mutations of humans, transforming into what we are introduced to as the infected, which are simply put just a type of zombie. The story, right at the start, addresses how the infected were created and why they act the way they do. This is perfect foundation for the story, as it not only allows atmosphere and world building to come around logically, but it also shows the viewer why this is all happening in the first place.
Host's internal temperature is over 94 degrees, and currently there are no reasons for fungi to evolve to be able to withstand higher temperatures. But what if that were to change? What if, for instance, the world were to get slightly warmer? Well, now there is reason to evolve. One gene mutates, and an Ascomycetia, Candida, ergot, Cordyceps, Aspergillus, any one of them could become capable of burrowing into our brains and taking control not of millions of us, but billions of us. Billions of puppets with poisoned minds, permanently fixed on one unifying goal: to spread the infection to every last human alive by any means necessary.
The story addresses our questions, making it so we can watch the show without simple questions being left unanswered. Now, it's important to note here that good shows are supposed to leave you with questions, a good example being why the main character, Ellie Williams, is immune to the infection. But in my opinion, this is more of a question that keeps you hooked rather than one that keeps you frustrated. Questions like what happened here are questions that should arguably be addressed at the beginning of the show, movie or game, as it allows proper world building. Now let's take a look at an example that, in my opinion, doesn't propose this world building as well. A Walking Dead is a show that's much similar to The Last of Us. Sorry, generalizing here, bear with me. The main story follows a viral outbreak that results in the infection of a majority of the world's population. The zombies here act the same sort of way, being extremely aggressive, but arguably more human in appearance. That's more or less where the similarities end. You can drop the pitchforks now. Where The Walking Dead takes a different approach, however, is the context. There is no explanation until episode 5 where the name Wildfire is briefly mentioned, and even then we are still given a lot of loose ends and speculation. What I mean is the show doesn't specify what wildfire is, how it works, or where it came from. Now, before anything else, I'm not saying The Walking Dead is a bad show. It objectively is an amazing show, as attested to anyone who's ever watched it. However, also according to everyone who's ever watched it, the biggest issue in The Walking Dead is consistency in pacing of the plot and overused character deaths and relationship. Wildfire being the core of the main plot would cause a majority of these issues for the people who had this specific problem with the show. Now back to Generation Zero. How does this relate to gaming and atmosphere, and how can developers use these tactics to improve their stories? Taking all this knowledge into Generation Zero, we can see that a lot of these tactics are not only used, but demonstrated to be effective, especially within its story. Generation Zero has clearly been built up by the developers to be an action game, but undeniably emotionally captivating as well. Everything from the design of the main enemies to the locations builds story often more times than the dialogue scenes. Even before this game had a story back in its earlier builds, it was still clear to the audience what was happening. The story may not have been implemented, leading to significantly more questions, but the player still understood what was going on. So now, armed with this knowledge, let me propose that same question again. If you were to design a game or movie today, and were asked to make it about a catastrophe, how'd you go about it? Atmosphere, world building, environmental storytelling, and emotionally captivating worlds are what makes good stories memorable and meaningful. Again, think Last of Us, think Generation Zero, Subnautica, all of these worlds were built up to be stories. Great, it's how games and shows end up being masterpieces in the eyes of viewers. That, in my opinion, is the best way to design a world that conveys story.